In the winter of 1886, deep in the Egyptian desert near the ancient city of Akhmim, French archaeologist Urbain Borient made a discovery that would shake the foundations of Christian scholarship. Buried in the tomb of a Christian monk, wrapped carefully in ancient linens, lay a manuscript that contained something extraordinary. A gospel claiming to be written by none other than Simon Peter, the leader of Jesus' apostles. But this wasn't just any gospel. The text contained within this weathered parchment told a story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection that differed dramatically from the familiar accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In this version, Pontius Pilate was completely innocent of Jesus' death. The resurrection was a public spectacle witnessed by crowds. Perhaps most controversially, the text seemed to suggest that Jesus might not have been fully human at all. Welcome to the extraordinary story of the Gospel of Peter, a lost text that offers us a fascinating glimpse into the diverse and often contentious world of early Christianity. Today, we'll explore not just what this remarkable document says, but why it was ultimately rejected by church authorities and what it reveals about the struggles to define Christian orthodoxy in the centuries following Jesus' death. This isn't just ancient history, it's a detective story involving theological intrigue, political maneuvering, and the fundamental question of who Jesus really was. So join me as we uncover the secrets of one of Christianity's most controversial lost Gospels. Chapter 1. The discovery that changed everything 8 minutes. To understand the significance of the Gospel of Peter's discovery, we need to transport ourselves back to 1886. Egypt was experiencing a golden age of archaeological discovery. Just a few years earlier, the famous Rosetta Stone had unlocked the secrets of hieroglyphics. Archaeologists from across Europe were flocking to Egypt, hoping to uncover the treasures buried in its ancient sands. Urbain Borient was leading a French expedition in Upper Egypt, specifically in the area around Akhmim, which the ancient Greeks had called Panopolis. This region, about 60 miles north of where the famous Nag Hammadi library would later be discovered, was known to contain numerous Christian burial sites dating from the early medieval period. In one particular tomb, Borient's team made an extraordinary find. The grave contained the carefully preserved remains of a Christian monk, and with him were 3 remarkable texts: the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, and portions of the Book of Enoch. The manuscript itself was written on parchment and dated to somewhere between the late 6th and early 9th centuries, making it one of the oldest known copies of these texts. But here's where the story becomes particularly intriguing. When Borient finally published his findings in 1892, 6 years after the discovery, the reaction from the scholarly community was explosive. This was the first time anyone had actually seen the text of the Gospel of Peter. Despite the fact that early Christian writers had been discussing and debating it for over a millennium, you see, the Gospel of Peter wasn't completely unknown to history. Church fathers, like Origen Eusebius of Caesarea, and most notably Bishop Serapion of Antioch, had written about this text in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But until Borient's discovery, scholars only had second-hand references. No one had actually read the Gospel itself. The manuscript fragment that Borient found contains approximately 60 verses, focusing exclusively on the Passion narrative: the trial, crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Importantly, the text begins and ends mid-sentence, indicating that what we have is only a portion of what was originally a much longer work. The medieval scribe who copied this text was apparently working from an already incomplete source. What made this discovery so significant wasn't just its age or rarity, but the radical differences it contained from the familiar gospel accounts. As scholars began to translate and analyze the text, they realized they were looking at a window into a very different version of early Christianity, one that had been largely forgotten by mainstream church history. The Gospel of Peter would force scholars to reconsider fundamental questions about the development of Christian doctrine, the diversity of early Christian communities, and the process by which certain texts came to be considered canonical while others were rejected as apocryphal. Chapter 2. A very different passion story, 10 minutes. When you open the Gospel of Peter and begin reading its account of Jesus' final days, you immediately notice that something is different. While the basic framework of the story, trial, crucifixion, death, and resurrection, remains the same, The details paint a dramatically altered picture of these events. Let's start with perhaps the most striking difference: the role of Pontius Pilate. In the Canonical Gospels, Pilate plays the central role in Jesus' trial and sentencing, even when the Gospel writers try to minimize his responsibility, showing him washing his hands or attempting to release Jesus. He remains the ultimate authority who pronounces the death sentence. The Gospel of Peter tells a completely different story. Here, Pilate washes his hands not as a symbolic gesture of reluctant participation, but as a genuine declaration of complete innocence. In this version, it is Herod Antipas, the Jewish governor of Galilee, who conducts the trial and pronounces the death sentence. Pilate, representing Roman authority, has absolutely no involvement in the judicial proceedings. This shift has profound implications. By removing Roman responsibility entirely, the Gospel of Peter places the blame for Jesus' death squarely and exclusively on Jewish authorities. This represents a more advanced stage of the growing separation between early Christianity and Judaism, a process that would have significant and tragic consequences throughout Christian history. But the differences don't stop there. In the Canonical Gospels, Jesus is mocked and tortured by Roman soldiers. The Gospel of Peter places these actions in the hands of Jewish guards and officials. They are the ones who put the purple robe on Jesus, place the crown of thorns on his head, and strike him. This systematic transfer of responsibility from Romans to Jews reflects the political and social pressures facing Christian communities in the Roman Empire. Even the inscription on the cross is different. Where the Canonical Gospels read, "King of the Jews," the Gospel of Peter reads, "King of Israel." It's a subtle but significant change that reflects different theological and political perspectives. Perhaps most intriguingly, Gospel of Peter records different final words for Jesus. Instead of my God, why have you forsaken me? Our Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," Jesus says. My power, you have left me." This seemingly small change would become crucial in later debates about Jesus' divine and human natures. The account of Jesus' death itself contains unique elements. The text describes how, when Jesus dies, he is taken up. But remarkably, his body remains on the cross. This strange detail would later fuel speculation about whether the author believed in a separation between Jesus' divine and human aspects. When Jesus is finally removed from the cross, his body touching the ground causes an earthquake, an event that the author specifically emphasizes. This detail becomes important when we consider later accusations that the gospel promoted docetic beliefs about Jesus' humanity. The burial account also differs significantly. While Joseph of Arimathea still requests Jesus' body, the tomb where he is placed becomes the setting for the most spectacular difference of all, the resurrection account. Chapter 3. The Spectacular Resurrection, 7 minutes. If you think the differences in the crucifixion account are dramatic, wait until you hear about the Gospel of Peter's description of Jesus' resurrection. This is where the text becomes truly extraordinary. Describing events that are found in no other Gospel account? In the Canonical Gospels, the resurrection itself is never directly described. We read about the empty tomb, the appearances to the disciples, and the reactions of those who witnessed the aftermath. But the actual moment of resurrection remains mysteriously veiled. The Gospel of Peter removes that veil entirely. According to this text, Jesus' resurrection was a public spectacle witnessed by multiple groups: Roman soldiers, Jewish elders, and crowds of people from the surrounding region. The account reads like something from a supernatural epic rather than the subtle, mysterious resurrection narratives we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The text describes how two men descended from heaven and entered the tomb. These figures then emerged, supporting Jesus between them. But here's where it gets even more extraordinary. Jesus appears to be larger than his two angelic companions, or alternatively, is floating higher than they are as they exit the tomb. Behind this trio comes a fourth figure, the cross itself, which had apparently been placed in the tomb with Jesus' body. Yes, you read that correctly. The cross walks out of the tomb and speaks. When a voice from heaven asks Jesus whether he has preached to the spirits of the dead, it is the cross that answers yes. This detail about preaching to the dead spirits connects to a theological concept found in 1 Peter 3:19. where it mentions Christ preaching to the spirits in prison, but the Gospel of Peter makes this a literal, visible event rather than a spiritual mystery. The entire resurrection spectacle is witnessed by the Roman guards, who immediately run to Pontius Pilate to report what they have seen. Pilate's response is telling. He declares that he is innocent of this entire affair and commands the witnesses to keep silent about what they have observed. This public nature of the resurrection represents a fundamental departure from the canonical accounts. Instead of the intimate, personal encounters with the risen Jesus that characterize the New Testament Gospels, we have a cosmic event visible to all. This difference raises important questions about the author's theological intentions and the communities for which this gospel was written. The spectacular nature of this resurrection account suggests several possibilities. It might reflect a community that felt the need to provide overwhelming proof of Jesus' divine power. Or it could indicate influence from Hellenistic religious traditions that emphasize dramatic divine manifestations. Chapter 4. The Docetic Controversy, 8 minutes. The most controversial aspect of the Gospel of Peter involves its potential connection to an early Christian heresy known as Docetism. To understand why this matters, we need to delve into one of the most significant theological debates of the early Christian period. Docetism comes from the Greek word dokein, meaning to seem or to appear. This heresy taught that Jesus only appeared to have a physical body, but was actually purely divine without genuine human flesh. For Docetists, the idea that God could truly become human, with all the limitations and sufferings that entailed, was philosophically and theologically unacceptable. This wasn't just abstract theological speculation. The debate arose partly because some early Christian groups were influenced by Greek philosophical traditions that viewed the physical world as inferior or even evil compared to the spiritual realm. If matter was inherently corrupt, how could the divine Son of God truly take on material flesh? The Gospel of Peter contains several passages that early church leaders interpreted as supporting Docetic beliefs. Let's examine these carefully. First, there's Jesus' cry from the cross, my power, you have left me." Some interpreters saw this as evidence that the divine aspect of Jesus' power has departed from the human Jesus at the moment of death, leaving only the human shell to die. This would align with certain Docetic teachings that distinguish between the divine Christ and the human Jesus. Second, the text mentions that during his crucifixion, Jesus was as if he felt no pain. Read through a Docetic lens. This could suggest that Jesus' physical body was not fully real, and therefore incapable of genuine suffering. Third, there's the strange detail about Jesus being taken up while his body remained on the cross. This apparent separation between Jesus and his physical form could be interpreted as supporting the Docetic idea that the divine Christ was separate from the material body. However, it's crucial to note that these interpretations are not necessarily correct. Modern scholars debate whether the Gospel of Peter was actually Docetic or whether it was simply written in a way that could be misinterpreted by those already inclined toward Docetic beliefs. Consider the earthquake that occurs when Jesus' body touches the ground after being removed from the cross. Why would a Docetic author emphasize the power inherent in Jesus' physical form, if that form was merely an illusion? This detail actually seems to argue against Docetic interpretation. The ambiguity surrounding these passages reflects the complex theological landscape of early Christianity. Different communities interpreted the same texts in vastly different ways, leading to intense debates about the fundamental nature of Jesus Christ. Chapter 5. Bishop Serapion's Dilemma. 6 minutes. The most detailed ancient account of the Gospel of Peter's reception comes from Eusebius of Caesarea's Ecclesiastical History. It's written in the early 4th century. Eusebius preserves a fascinating story about Serapion, who served as Bishop of Antioch between 190 and 203 CE. Serapion's experience with the Gospel of Peter reveals the fluid nature of biblical authority in the early church. When Serapion first encountered a Christian community in the Syrian city of Rosses that was using this gospel, his initial response was remarkably tolerant. Without having read the text himself, he gave permission for its continued use, reasoning that if the only issue dividing the community was whether this particular book could be read, then they should simply go ahead and read it. This response tells us something important about the state of biblical canon in the late 2nd century. There was no established list of approved books that Serapion could consult. The process of determining which texts were authoritative was still ongoing, and individual bishops had considerable discretion in these matters. However, Serapion's attitude changed dramatically when he learned that the Gospel of Peter was being used by groups known as Docetists. These were Christians who denied the full humanity of Jesus Christ. Suddenly, the stakes were much higher. This wasn't just about reading an alternative account of Jesus' life. It was about fundamental questions of Christian doctrine. Serapion then actually read the Gospel of Peter for himself. His conclusion was nuanced. He found that most of the text conformed to Orthodox Christian teaching, but certain passages contained additions that supported heterodox beliefs. He also concluded that the Gospel was pseudepigraphic, that is, falsely attributed to the Apostle Peter. Based on these concerns, Serapion wrote a treatise condemning the use of the Gospel of Peter and forbidding its reading in Christian communities under his authority. This represents one of the earliest documented cases of a specific text being officially rejected by church leadership. But Serapion's story raises an important question. Was the Gospel of Peter that he read the same text that was discovered at Akhmim in 1886? We have no direct quotations from Serapion's version of the Gospel, making it impossible to compare the two texts definitively. Some scholars believe they are the same. Others argue that multiple different Gospels may have been attributed to Peter in the early Christian period. This uncertainty reflects a broader challenge in studying early Christian literature. The practice of attributing texts to apostolic figures was common, and multiple works often circulated under the same name. We know of several other texts attributed to Peter: letters, apocalypses, acts, and preaching texts. Chapter 6, The Question of Authorship, 5 minutes. Modern scholars are unanimous in their conclusion that the Gospel of Peter was not written by the Apostle Simon Peter. This determination is based on several lines of evidence that clearly indicate a much later date of composition. The most obvious indicator is the text's treatment of Jewish identity. Throughout the Gospel, Jews are consistently referred to as they, their laws, their customs, their actions. This external perspective would be extremely unlikely from Peter, who was himself a Jew. The language suggests an author writing from outside the Jewish community, viewing it as a separate and often hostile group. Even more telling is the complete exoneration of Roman authority combined with the total condemnation of Jewish leadership. This pattern reflects the political pressures facing Christian communities in the Roman Empire during the 2nd century and later. Early Christian writers increasingly sought to present Christianity as compatible with Roman rule while distancing it from Judaism, which had been associated with various rebellions against Rome. The linguistic and literary evidence also points to a later date. The Greek style and vocabulary are consistent with 2nd century writing rather than the apostolic period. The author demonstrates knowledge of multiple gospel traditions, suggesting a time when various accounts of Jesus' life had circulated and could be compared and synthesized. Perhaps most significantly, the text reflects theological developments that occurred well after Peter's death. The sharp distinction between Christians and Jews, separate communities, was unfully developed until the late 1st or early 2nd century. During Peter's lifetime, Christianity was still largely a movement within Judaism rather than a separate religion. The Gospel's handling of the resurrection narrative also suggests later development. The spectacular public nature of the resurrection account may reflect apologetic concerns. The need to provide overwhelming evidence for Jesus' divine power in the face of skepticism or competing religious claims. All of this evidence points to composition, sometime in the 2nd century CE, probably in Syria or Egypt, by a Christian author who chose to attribute the work to Peter in order to give it apostolic authority. This practice, known as pseudepigraphy, was common in the ancient world and wasn't necessarily considered fraudulent in the way we might view it today. Chapter 7. Why it matters today. 6 minutes. You might wonder why a 2nd century text that was rejected by early church leaders matters for our understanding of Christianity today. The Gospel of Peter's significance extends far beyond its specific content. 2. What it reveals about the development of Christian doctrine and identity. First, it demonstrates the remarkable diversity that existed within early Christianity. Far from being a monolithic movement with unanimous beliefs, early Christian communities held widely varying views about fundamental questions. Who was Jesus? What was the relationship between his divine and human natures? How should Christians relate to Jewish law and Roman authority? What texts should be considered authoritative? The Gospel of Peter represents one strand of this diverse tapestry. Its existence proves that significant numbers of Christians found its particular interpretation of Jesus' story compelling enough to preserve and transmit. The fact that it survived to be copied in the 6th and 9th centuries suggests that some communities continued to value it long after. Mainstream church authorities had rejected it. Second, the text illuminates the process by which the biblical canon was formed. The story of Bishop Serapion's changing attitude toward the gospel shows that canonical decisions weren't made in a vacuum. They involved real communities, real conflicts, and real pastoral concerns. The criteria for inclusion or exclusion weren't purely theological, but also involved practical considerations about community, unity, and orthodoxy. Third, the Gospel of Peter highlights the importance of manuscript discoveries for our understanding of early Christianity. Until 1886, scholars could only speculate about what this famous but lost gospel might have contained. The Akhmim discovery provided concrete evidence that forced revision of scholarly theories and opened new avenues of research. The text also raises important questions about religious authority and diversity. How should modern Christians understand the fact that their ancestors held such diverse beliefs about fundamental doctrines? What does it mean that some early Christian communities found spiritual meaning in texts that were later rejected as heretical? Finally, the Gospel of Peter serves as a reminder that our understanding of early Christianity continues to evolve as new discoveries are made. The manuscript finds at Nag Hammadi, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other archaeological discoveries have repeatedly challenged and refined scholarly consensus about Christian origins. Conclusion: the ongoing legacy. 3 minutes. The Gospel of Peter stands as a fascinating testament to the complexity and diversity of early Christianity. From its dramatic discovery in an Egyptian tomb to its controversial content and eventual rejection by church authorities, this text continues to challenge our understanding of how Christian doctrine developed and how the biblical canon was formed. Whether or not the Gospel promoted Docetic beliefs remains a matter of scholarly debate. What's clear is that it represents a genuine attempt by an early Christian community to understand and communicate the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection, the spectacular nature of its resurrection account, the complete exoneration of Roman authority, and the emphasis on Jewish responsibility all reflect the specific concerns and circumstances of Christians living in the Roman Empire during the 2nd century. The story of Bishop Serapion's encounter with the gospel reminds us that the formation of Christian orthodoxy was a gradual, often contentious process involving real people making difficult decisions about competing truth claims. The diversity of early Christian beliefs was unto weakness to be deplored, but a natural consequence of a dynamic religious movement grappling with profound theological questions. Today, the Gospel of Peter continues to be studied by scholars seeking to understand the full spectrum of early Christian thought. While it didn't become part of the biblical canon, it remains an invaluable witness to the rich theological creativity of the early church, the ongoing human quest to understand the divine. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable text, we're reminded that the story of Christianity is far more complex and interesting than we often realize. The Gospel of Peter may not have made it into our Bibles, but it has certainly earned its place in the larger story of Christian history and thought. The manuscript discovered by Urbain Borient in 1886 continues to speak to us across the centuries, offering insights into both the diversity of earliest Christian belief and the ongoing human struggle to comprehend the mystery of divine incarnation. In its pages, we find not just an ancient text, but a window into the passionate theological debates that shaped the faith of millions.